this start? Why did you join the Army? That's first of all, where are you from and why did you join the
I was 5 years old and my mother took me to West Point on a visit. And after I had visited the place, I told her I'm going to go to West Point. So I think that's where it began. And I really never deviated from that path. I mean, one of the reasons I went to Virginia Military Institute for a year was that I had not been appointed the first time around to West Point. And I really didn't know much about VMI. My grandfather, I grew up in my maternal grandfather's home. He summoned me to his room and announced to me that he had found a place for me to spend a year before I ultimately went to West Point. And he said, it's a place called VMI. You will like it. You will enjoy it very much. Of course, when I reported to VMI on the first day and someone stopped me on the way through the Jackson Arch and said, give me 72 push-ups for the class of 72, I then discovered that my grandfather was a sick sadist because I said, this is not necessarily what I signed up for. So VMI was probably the best thing that ever happened to me because nothing could have prepared me better. And it also was a place that inculcated strong values of service and integrity and honor and so forth in ways that I don't think we did nearly as well at West Point. And I saw many standards of discipline at that point in 1971 in terms of your appearance and drilling and marching and all these kinds of things were vastly superior to what I found later on going to West Point. And later I read the Patton papers and I found that General Patton's comments about West Point and VMI mirrored my own. One of the things he said, well, West Point is a much more gentlemanly atmosphere. No one can touch you. Whereas at VMI could touch you. And I do remember an upper class, he was a first classman. And I don't really to this day completely know what the hell I did, but he pulled me out of the rat line and held me up against the wall for doing something. And then he said, do you understand? And of course, I wasn't going to say, no, I have no goddamn idea what you're talking about. I said, yes, sir. And he put me back in the rat line and off I went. And of course, we had all these horror stories, most of which are true about what it was like in the rat line in those years. I mean, you would run in place until you threw up. And then when you were finished throwing up, you would run again some more. I mean, it was a much rougher environment, but it was a good preparation for the military academy. It gave me a different perspective because most of the people that go to West Point are 18, straight out of high school. They've never seen anything else. That's all they know. And so there's no ability to sort of stand back, evaluate what is or isn't good or what might be different. So from the very beginning, I was inclined to think a little differently about things. Second thing that had a big impact on me was being an exchange student in Germany from 1969 to 1970. And I went to a very fine Quaker men's private school. I was raised as a Quaker, believe it or not. And I competed for a spot to study in Germany, and the American Friends Services Committee sent me to northern Germany to a town in English called Brunswick, Braunschweig in German. And I ended up living with a family the father of which had been an officer in the Wehrmacht and had actually served in the German army from about 1931 till 1945. And he had seen a lot of action. He was a combat engineer, but typical for the officer class, very well educated. His hobby was Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and biblical texts. He was very interested in archaeology and so forth. He had a big impact because he eventually discovered that I was not going to reproach him for being an evil Nazi. I just wanted to know about him and his experiences in the military. And then he began to teach me a great deal. And so an awful lot of what happens in 1991 and 1990, 91, when I had the opportunity to sort of mold the 2nd Squadron, 2nd Cavalry for action, these 1,100 men, 42 tanks, 42 Bradleys, 8 guns. And then subsequently what I'm able to do with the 1st to the 4th Cavalry after the war from 92 to 94 really reflected that German influence. because the Germans were very, very big on simplicity, big on what I would call orders from the saddle. In other words, discarding these detailed written orders in favor of a highly trained battle drill oriented force, to the point where the battle drills were automatic, and then you would improvise based on the existing battle drill to deal with the situation that you encountered, which you knew was always going to be a little different from what you originally intended or anticipated. And then the idea that you have to be at the front. I had to fight very hard to be in a tank. And the reason I wanted a tank was it was simply faster to move in that, and there was nothing that you could not do. And if you had to fight to influence the battle, you could have a profound impact with just one tank. So I ended up doing that. And then when I was at Fort Riley, the NTC provided a wonderful test ground to test out some other ideas and things. And I had 12 NCOs and officers who'd served with me in the 2nd Cavalry who joined me in the 1st and the 4th. So I had a good cadre there that understood the thinking, the rationale, and it paid huge dividends. Now, it didn't make me very popular. And some of the people that went on to command battalions and squadrons later on, who were captains or majors, they told me the first thing they got when they showed up at a division was that we don't want any of this Macgregor stuff. Don't come in here and try to do anything new or different. Just do your job. In other words, don't question anything. Just go and do what everybody else does. And one of the things that I didn't like was this notion of, well, you learn by failing. My argument was, well, you can, but you also learn by success. And if you do something and it works, you don't forget it. You can do it again. You don't have to fail at everything on the assumption that having failed, you've learned something. What if you didn't learn how to do it better? Or just because you failed, well, that didn't work. What else are we going to do? And I found that most of what the U.S. Army doctrine was telling people to do made no sense. It was going to get everybody killed in a real fight with a real enemy. Now, we haven't had to deal with that very much, fortunately. And so we've kind of atrophied. And we spend too much time congratulating ourselves on how wonderful we are and how much better we are than everybody else. It's a catastrophe. So my personal nightmare from 91 onward was really that we would end up like the Prussian army at Jena Auerstedt in 1806. The Prussians went out there and they were essentially organized, trained, and equipped exactly as they had been under Frederick the Great during the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. So they were this permanent tribute or replica of the army that was successful in 1763 and 1806. Along comes the Grand Army under Napoleon, and we know the rest of the story. They annihilated the Prussians, destroyed them. So my concern is that we end up with somebody we didn't expect who has figured out ISR, strike, maneuver, and sustainment, how to integrate those, has changed the way it fights, and ultimately devastates us. And I testified in 2017 in front of the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Air-Land Subcommittee, and I tried to make that point, but it fell on deaf ears. And I tried to describe what we would experience. The first thing, you get to the battlefield, there are all sorts of sensors operating, and those are not all obvious. But the point is that forms of overhead surveillance are going to detect you, as well as things on the ground. The next thing that happens is loitering munitions that come in to pick and choose from the various targets on the ground. In other words, command and control or logistics, whatever they decide is important. And then very shortly after these things are confirmed, in comes the rocket artillery, and the tactical ballistic missiles are headed over your head to destroy the command and control structure behind you. As this all happens very quickly, and you have to organize for this. You have to be widely dispersed, which puts a premium on leadership at the lowest level. But you also have to have tactical air and missile defense. You have to have the ability to acquire these things, because if you've got tactical air and missile defense and you have radars that allow you to acquire these things, you can defeat the things above you. But at the same time, you've got to move. If you are static for any length of time, you're going to be found, targeted, and destroyed. So all of these things were not widely appreciated, and everybody sort of said, oh, well, that's nice. And now we're beginning to see it. We've seen it in Nagorno-Karabakh in Armenia. We've gotten a good taste of it from the Azeri Turks using the loitering munitions and rocket artillery. It's the tip of a proverbial iceberg.